Yeah, first of all, I just want to thank everybody for being here, especially the organizers. I think this conference was supposed to happen. We didn't think it was going to be virtual, and we've transitioned into this in a way that has been kind of supportive. And so I just want to thank the organizers for that. Also, Felicia, thank you so much. I think your work around the unnameable war, I think, has been in my mind as I was working on this as well. And so thank you for that. Great. Okay. Described as that which makes subjects mutually accessible to each other, copresence has been written about as a mode or sense of being with others, humans and non-humans, crossing both physical and technological generated environments. A relatively underexplored concept in anthropology, we see it in Aisha Beliso-De Jesús' 2015 book, Electric Santería, where she urges us to think about Santería copresences as a somatic, embodied experience of walking with. Here, copresences are sensed through chills, shivers, tingles, premonitions, and possessions. They produce haunting sensations that can be reviewed through the body, creating a primarily affective and sensory mode of relation between objects, people, ghosts, etc. Copresences also travel and traverse time, undoing linearity and showing up in the form of a past that is not past. They make themselves known through memories, stories, and past events. In Beliso-De Jesús' work, Santería copresences are the Orisha, various spirits, and familial ancestors that are recognized as being on, around, and within practitioners' bodies. Active agents, they provide evidence of their presence, are fed, honored, treated as people, and form part of practitioners' sixth sense. Copresences and the everyday rituals that engage them are meant to bring balance to people's lives and highlight the somatic practices and spiritual relationships practitioners engage to cultivate these relationships. As hybrid/material immaterial agents of association, they operate on, in, and as the body. And in the context of the racial histories of Santería practices in Cuba, copresences are additionally understood as historically emergent in enslaved people's pragmatic, everyday negotiations with colonialism and racial violence. As a theoretical and material formulation, copresences intercept long traditions in the study of religion that continue to examine African and African diaspora spiritualities through theories of transcendence and mediation. By prioritizing these African diasporic and non-Abrahamic ontologies of presence, Beliso-De Jesús offers a way for us to take seriously what she explains as the constitutive body logics and worlds produced through these ontologies. Her interest here is not to situate these ontologies as exemplary sites of decolonization or resistance, but to examine how copresences transform the very conception of being from within particular racial religious schemas. In my work on colonial Christianity in Accra, I attempt to look at the forms of womanhood that were institutionalized by several missionary churches in the mid-19th to early 20th century, and their subsequent reverberations on the contemporary politics of gender, race, and sexuality in Ghana. While historians would advise us to be cautious of forgetting about the intricate dynamics that characterize centuries-long processes of social transformation, in a sense, the story is simple. European imperialist expansion criminalized and racialized indigenous African ontologies, instituting Victorian sexual mores through Christianity, as well as binary conceptions of gender and sex. In setting up girls' schools that were to ensure appropriate behavior for Christian society, the colonial mission, in collaboration with Euro-African women, instituted the various forms of female persona, such as the Christian school teacher and the Christian schoolgirl, that were to congeal into an aspirational Christian womanhood and femininity. Through my work, I use copresences to theorize more accurately the legacies of these gendered and racialized logics in contemporary Ghanaian society. If copresences are a form of hauntology, how might we develop methodologies that attune themselves to the unknown? So in this next section, I'm going to be speaking briefly about Katherine Mulgrave, who is the third person in the picture from the left. And here she is with a picture of her family. And she was an African Jamaican missionary who was involved in the training and mentoring of many women who formed the nucleus of the emerging clergy in the Gold Coast. So in the 19th century, Mulgrave moved to the Gold Coast from Jamaica and married a missionary and stayed there. So I'm going to be giving a bit of background into her life. As a child, Mulgrave and two of her sisters were kidnapped by slave raiders and set for Cuba. The ship got wrecked off the coast of Jamaica, but Mulgrave was adopted by the governor of Jamaica, who then gave her the family's last name. Most of the published information about Mulgrave comes from the letters of her second husband, John Zimmerman, who was the head of the mission in the Gold Coast, who she married in 1851. In many of these accounts, her life is depicted as an extraordinary young girl who was captured, rescued, and who then returned to the continent to become a pioneer of one of the major colonial institutions of the century. Per the records available to us from the Basel Mission archives, Mulgrave is highlighted as an example of successful African missionary work in Africa, with her efforts in the education and socialization of girls. As a teacher and a missionary, Mulgrave was a part of many Afro-descendants in the 19th century who were being sent by missions to proselytize in Africa because of their ability to acclimatize to the tropical climate in comparison to their European counterparts. The presence of West Indians from the then British and Danish-controlled Caribbean islands was also set to prove to indigenous Africans that there were indeed Black Christians in the world. The alumni of these castle schools and missionaries went on to hold important positions in politics, medicine, law, administration, and the newly emerging Gold Coast, becoming a part of the cultural elite class. In maintaining a Black diasporic elite Christian femininity as a standard for womanhood among African women, the missions articulated a racialized colonial vision of personhood, which would eventually become indigenized and subsumed within the very hierarchies that these new forms of self maintained. But what did it mean for Katherine to have been captured as a girl and to have witnessed the brutality of the hold upon the vessel Carolina? And how do we examine her return as a Christian missionary to a land known and unknown? In Position of the Unthought, Saidiya Hartman challenges the research of scholars in the 1970s and 80s who utilized the archive to reveal the agency of dominated groups, a paradigm which still reigns in much of current Africanist scholarship. The archive, she explains, represents the impossibility of fully recovering the experience of the enslaved and the emancipated. Rather, what it reveals is how the very terms of negation become the central possibility of action. In other words, the silences of the archive only reveal the fractures that sustain their very documentation, legitimacy, and narrative power. Hartman's influential 2008 essay, Venus in Two Acts, calls for a critical fabulation, an approach which attempts to jeopardize the status of the event, to displace the received or authorized account, and to imagine what might have happened or might have been said or might have been done. To quote, the intent of this practice is not to give voice to the slave, but rather to imagine what cannot be verified. In drawing on poetics to intervene in conventional historiography, Hartman invokes us to write our now as it is interrupted by this past, and to imagine a free state, not as the time before captivity or slavery, but rather as the anticipated future of this writing. This is not merely an attempt, however, at a redemptive historiography, but a way to unsettle the narratives of domination that the archive sustains. In this way, figures such as Mulgrave, who are situated within a Black Atlantic missionizing project, are brought into sharp relief as they emerge as troubling copresences in our archive of Christianity's relationship to Blackness. The historiography of 18th century Europe, which placed African subjectivities and religion outside the realm of the human, reveal Christianity's inextricability from Enlightenment humanism and the construction of Africans as religiously and racially inferior people. As Sylvia Wynter reminds us, the Enlightenment shift from human as religious to human as secular, rational, political subject was made possible only on the basis of the dynamics of a colonizer-colonized relation that the West was to discursively constitute and empirically institutionalize on the islands of the Caribbean and on the mainlands of the Americas. This positioned man in such a way as to disavow other coexisting modes of being human. And while Black and African liberation theologies have long disrupted these dominant conceptions, they nonetheless continue to operate within them. Today, Ghana's Christian moral and political landscape is a site of negation for those who refuse and are unable to take on these forms of personhood, even as it has incorporated many forms of indigenous personhood into its metaphysical setup. Its anti-indigenous ontological orientations are easily weaponized against queer, Rastafari, Muslim communities, producing a contentious terrain for Black life. As I conduct fieldwork in Accra, communing and sharing spaces with friends, interlocutors, returnee and non-returnee women, some of whom are queer, Rastafari, Christian, and Muslim, the vexed co-presences of these racialized schemas about gender and embodiment make themselves known in small and large ways. A touch, an open question, nervous laughter. They suture the very intimacies we build in order to navigate the material and social dimensions of post-Enlightenment modernity and the Black post-colonial subjectivities that shape life in the city. By historicizing Afro-diasporic Christian missionization through questions of agency and subjectivity in place of its ontological dimensions, contemporary scholarship has failed to pay attention to the effects of Afro-Protestant motifs in informing Black social practices and life. Black Christian kinship, even in its emergent secular forms, continues to be a suturing force throughout Africa and its diaspora, even in Black studies. As Beliso-De Jesús reminds us, co-presences are not always positive. They can be demanding, jealous, petty, or spiteful, and require complex social spiritual manipulations. I attune myself to them with trepidation. Consequently, if co-presences reconstitute anthropological ideas of embodied subjecthood, how might we let them interrupt not only our readings of those we encounter in the archive, but our own understandings of what it means to build, own, or maintain an archive? What else might we become attuned to if we pay attention to how these unknowable fragmentary moments and speculations frame our very understanding of the archive? And how might co-presences help us conceptualize archives as not only national, monolithic, but scalar, multiple, and excessive in meaning? Possibilities emerge in the work of Adjoa Ama, a Ghanaian British artist, anthropologist, and archivist. In 2015, Arma founded Samang Archive, a collection of photographic negatives gathered across Ghana that currently approximates about 100,000 images. Samang is the Akan word for ghost and is also the word used to describe the photographic negative. As such, the ghost is a central conceptual figure in Arma's practice in how she thinks about the archive and the kinds of relationships she builds through collecting. For her, photographic negatives may also be the prototype for something, a narrative something, she says, where fiction, lies, or dreams may be written into these photographs. In thinking about these negatives as prototypes that may be built upon or ghosts that haunt, we are pulled by sharp into those unknown who are still with us in residence time. My interest here isn't only in the visual images Arma collects, but in how she frames and reconstitutes her relationship to the act of gathering itself and to the simultaneous publicness and opacity of this particular archive. We do not know anyone. In place of tracing particular stories or histories, Arma inhabits a mediative and meditative connection to her work, uplifting the new relationship she forms through her travels as these electric blue and rust-tinged negatives lead her through and across time. For Arma, this ghost archive intervenes in the contemporary digital visual landscape to invoke a Black subjectivity that is interested in building a relation that goes beyond the calculus of ancestry, kinship, or familiarity. It releases us from the burdens of the biological familial towards a collective memorialization that is sustained by intention and action. Gathered through liaisons with former photographers, old photo houses, and family collections, this free, public, hidden archive is also a documentation of the many disconnections, abandonments, and conflicts that make it. It is still unclear whether Katherine was from Rwanda or Sao Tome, as her descriptions of her home correspond and diverge in inconclusive ways. But in my research for this paper, I came across a review of a play about her in the Jamaican Gleaner, titled Katherine Mulgrave, An African Odyssey. The play spans Mulgrave's 58 years and experiences in the Gold Coast, and her connection to Jamaica is at once natal and diasporic. In this rewriting centuries later, in a digital archive, Mulgrave is given a familial connection in the form of the spirit of her grandfather. In relation to the ways in which Blackness has been translated as ungeographic, Mulgrave's dispossession is mediated through the figure of the ghost, a moving negative that may show up wherever she may be. Thank you.